I didn't go back for the congratulations. I went back because my mother finally said out loud what she'd been whispering for years right in front of every person she'd ever wanted to impress. She looked at me across that dining room full of candlelight and good crystal and said, loudly enough for the table to hear, "Why would someone like you even bother showing up?" Polite smiles went stiff. My father studied the tablecloth. My brother's fiancé stopped mid-laugh. And Marcus, went pale so completely, so instantly, that his wineglass trembled in his hand. He wasn't looking at my mother when it happened. He was looking at me. Like a man who had just understood that the ground beneath his future was not what he thought it was. Then he stood up and said, "That's enough." But you can't understand that moment without understanding what came before it. All of it. I was 22 when my parents explained their philosophy on fairness. Not in those words. They never used those words. It happened in the kitchen of our house in Mississauga, on a Tuesday evening in October, when the maple outside had gone full red, and the light through the window made everything look warmer than it was. I had my acceptance letter on the table. University of Toronto, Faculty of Medicine. 4 years of undergraduate science already behind me. Loans already started. A supplementary form that required a parental financial declaration I couldn't complete alone. I didn't cry. I didn't perform. I said, "I need you to co-sign the OSAP declaration. It's just a form. It changes what I qualify for." My mother was washing dishes. She didn't turn around. "We've talked about this," she said. We hadn't, not really. What we'd done was circle it. Every time I got close to the center, she moved the conversation sideways. The interest alone on what I'm already carrying, I started. "Other people manage," she said. "You'll manage." My father was at the kitchen table behind me. I heard him exhale, that long, slow breath he used when he wanted to seem neutral. "Your mother and I think it's important that you learn to stand on your own," he said. "It builds character." I turned to look at him. "You paid for Ryan's engineering program, both years of college before that." A pause. Ryan's situation was different, my mother said, still not turning around. "How?" She set down the dish, finally looked at me. It just was. That was the full explanation. That was everything they were willing to offer. Ryan's situation was different. Ryan, who was 2 years younger than me, who had switched programs twice, who had called home crying from residence in first year, and received a next-day visit and a new laptop. Ryan, whose textbooks appeared without being asked for. Ryan, whose car insurance my parents paid until he was 26. I stood in that kitchen for another minute. Then I picked up the acceptance letter, folded it along its original crease, and put it in my bag. That night, I sat at my desk in the bedroom I'd grown up in and did the numbers for the last time. The real numbers, not the hopeful ones. Federal loans, provincial loans, bursaries I'd already applied for, the part-time hospital admin job I'd been working since third year. The gap was not catastrophic in isolation, but medicine is not a 4-year degree. It's 4 years of medical school after an undergraduate, then residency, then fellowship if you specialize. The debt I was looking at, without family support, without a cosigner, with interest accumulating through a decade of training, was the kind of number that changes how you make every decision for the rest of your life. I didn't sleep much, but by morning, I had a different kind of clarity. Not the kind that comes from a solution, the kind that comes from finally accepting the shape of something you'd been refusing to look at directly. They loved Ryan in receipts, and I wasn't on the ledger. I deferred my medical school acceptance. I didn't tell them right away. I found a full-time position as a medical administrator at a regional hospital in Hamilton, 40 minutes away, and I moved into a bachelor apartment with a radiator that clanged at night and a window that looked directly into the side of another building. I furnished it in stages, starting with a mattress and a second-hand desk. It smelled like old carpet and someone else's cooking, and it was the first space that was entirely mine. My mother called 2 weeks after I moved out. Her voice had the particular warmth she reserved for situations where she wanted something returned. "We just want to make sure you're okay," she said. "I'm fine. You didn't have to leave so suddenly." "I know." A pause. "Ryan's been asking about you." I doubted that, but I let it pass. "Tell him I said hi." She waited for more. I didn't offer any. We said goodbye the way you do when a conversation was never really going anywhere to begin with. I worked for 2 years before I reapplied. In those 2 years, I paid down a portion of my existing loans, built savings, and learned things about how hospitals actually function that most medical students never see from the inside. I watched physicians make administrative decisions. I watched the gap between what got funded and what was needed. I understood, before I had any letters after my name, that medicine was not just a clinical discipline, it was an institutional one. When I was accepted again, I was 26. I had a modest line of credit from a professional lender, a detailed repayment model that I had built and rebuilt until I trusted it, and the absolute certainty that no one in my family had any part in what I was building. I didn't tell them I'd reapplied. I didn't tell them I'd been accepted. I told them nothing about medical school for 4 years. They found out, eventually. People in Mississauga talk. Someone's cousin knew someone who knew me, the way it always happens in mid-sized cities where everyone is 3 conversations from everyone else. My father called. His voice was careful, hopeful in the way of a person who wants credit for something they didn't contribute to. "We heard you're in medicine," he said. "Yes. We're proud of you." The word proud landed strangely, not painfully, just oddly, the way a word sounds when it's been separated too long from the action it's supposed to represent. "Thank you," I said, "because it cost me nothing." He cleared his throat. "Your mother and I were wondering if you'd come for Christmas this year." I went. Not because I had forgiven anything, because I was not interested in maintaining a war. There's a difference. I showed up, I ate the food, I sat at the table where 4 years earlier they had declined to sign a form that would have cost them nothing but their signature. I watched my mother serve Ryan seconds without being asked. I watched my father laugh loudest at Ryan's stories. I observed it all with the same detachment I'd been practicing for years, and I drove home the same evening. Residency came next, internal medicine, then a fellowship in nephrology, kidney disease, transplant evaluation, chronic care. It was not glamorous in the way people imagine medicine to be glamorous. It was exhausting, precise, and quietly essential. By the time I finished my fellowship, I was 31. I was carrying less debt than most of my colleagues, and I held a staff physician position at a transplant center in Toronto. What I also held, though I did not speak of this to my family, was a position on the Provincial Transplant Review Committee. Organ allocation is one of the most regulated processes in Canadian medicine. Recipients are assessed not only on medical urgency but on a constellation of factors: lifestyle, compliance, history, support systems, financial and social stability. The committee does not make these decisions alone or arbitrarily, but we sit in the room. Our names are on the documents. Our assessments carry weight. This is not power you announce. It is power you handle the way you handle anything irreplaceable, quietly, carefully, with full awareness of what it means. I had been in my staff position for 8 months when I got a notification on a professional platform. Not a personal message. A connection suggestion, algorithmically generated, the kind you ignore 90% of the time. But the name stopped me. Marcus Donnelly. I knew that name, not personally, professionally. A file had crossed my desk 6 weeks earlier, as part of a preliminary committee review, not final assessment, early stage screening. Marcus Donnelly, 34, referred for transplant evaluation by his nephrologist, early stage renal decline, not yet critical but trending in a direction that made pre-assessment responsible. Clean history, stable employment, no red flags. A file I had noted and passed along without particular thought. I looked at the profile. Dark hair, broad smile, based in Mississauga. Then I saw the tagged photo below it. My brother Ryan, arm around his shoulder. Caption: "Best day she said yes." My mother was in the background, beaming. I sat with that for a long time. Life has a way of arranging coincidences that feel less like accidents, and more like unfinished business arriving with paperwork. The engagement party invitation came 3 weeks later. My mother called to deliver it personally, voice warm with the occasion. "We'd love for you to be there," she said. "Ryan really wants you there." Whether Ryan wanted anything specific was, as always, unclear to me. But I said yes. I said yes because I was already ethically obligated to address the situation regardless. Once I identified a personal connection to a file in my review chain, protocol required disclosure. I had already initiated that process. My name would be formally separated from Marcus Donnelly's file. Another committee member would take primary on his case. This was not optional. This was what the system required, and I had set it in motion without hesitation. But neutrality does not mean absence. I drove to Mississauga on a Saturday in November. The party was at my parents' house, the same split level, now with a new deck and professional landscaping that had appeared sometime in the past few years. The inside smelled the same, lemon cleaner and something baked and the particular warmth of a house that has always belonged to other people. My mother saw me near the entrance before I'd had a chance to remove my coat. Her expression did the thing it always did, a fraction of a second of genuine reaction before the social performance replaced it. "You came," she said, as though this were unexpected. Ryan found me in the hallway. He was heavier than I remembered, happier seeming, with the relaxed ease of a person whose life had cooperated with his expectations. "You look serious," he said, which was his way of saying hello. "I'm always serious," I said, which was mine. Marcus was introduced to me as though we were strangers, which technically we were. He was warm, attentive to Ryan, good with the older relatives. He shook my hand and said he'd heard a lot about me, which I doubted. His eyes held nothing unusual. He had no reason to connect me to anything professional. Not yet. The dinner was the kind my mother excelled at, abundant, aesthetically considered, performed. She moved through the room collecting compliments the way some people collect rent. My father told the same 3 stories he'd been telling for a decade. Ryan and Marcus sat at the center of it all, the obvious purpose of the evening. I was seated at the far end of the table. Not hostile placement, just incidental. The family member who required the least management got the leftover chair. I had long since stopped feeling anything about this particular category of message. Then my mother, midway through the main course, during a pause in the conversation that she moved to fill, looked down the table at me and said it. "Why would someone like you even bother showing up?" She meant it as a joke. That was the worst part. She said it with a light laugh, a sideways glance at the woman beside her, an invitation to find me mildly absurd. The woman beside her gave an uncertain smile. Someone across the table didn't react at all. My father looked down. Marcus went pale. Not gradually, immediately. The color left his face in a single movement, like something had been switched off underneath it. He wasn't looking at my mother, he was looking at me. And in the way that people who work within institutions learn to read professional recognition, I could see the exact moment he placed me. Not as Ryan's sister. As the name on a document. As a title attached to a process that currently held some jurisdiction over his future. His glass trembled. He set it down. "That's enough," he said. My mother turned to him, smile still present, confused by the temperature change. "Marcus." I said, "That's enough." The table went quiet in the particular way that happens when someone has spoken with more weight than the occasion seemed to call for. Ryan looked between his fiancé and his mother. My father set down his fork. Marcus stood slowly. He looked at me with an expression that had moved past shock into something more complicated, professional alarm, threaded through personal disbelief. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said, not accusingly, just stating a fact he was still processing. "I was invited," I said evenly. "I know." He exhaled. "I know that." Ryan's voice came from across the table, careful, confused. "Does someone want to explain what's happening?" No one answered immediately. My mother's smile had finally dissolved. She looked between Marcus and me with the expression of a person watching a conversation conducted in a language they can't quite follow. Marcus sat back down. He seemed to be making a decision about how much to say in this room and landing on very little. He paused. "I didn't realize you were Ryan's sister." "I am," I said. Another silence. My mother's eyes sharpened in my direction, something old and familiar in them. The same look from the kitchen in October, 12 years ago. Inconvenience with a face on it. "I'm sure whatever this is," she said. Voice controlled now. "We don't need to make it a whole production," Marcus said very quietly. "With respect, you might want to wait before deciding what this is." We moved the real conversation to the back sunroom, away from the catered embarrassment of the main table. My parents, Ryan, Marcus, me. The kind of space a family occupies when something has to be said that can't be managed at a dinner party. Marcus spoke first. He was careful, even in distress. "I'm in the middle of a medical review process," he said, directing this to Ryan. "Pre-assessment. For transplant." Ryan hadn't known the full details, I could tell from his face. "Your sister she holds a position on the committee connected to that review." Ryan looked at me. "You're on a transplant committee." "Yes. And you're on Marcus's, you're reviewing his file." "I was," I said. "I've already filed for formal recusal. Another physician will take primary responsibility for his assessment. That process is already done. Marcus's head came up. Already? I identified the connection and disclosed it to the committee chair the week the invitation arrived. It's documented. You're not affected. He stared at me. Something in his expression shifted. The alarm receded. What replaced it was harder to name, a kind of stunned recognition, like he'd been braced for one thing and received something entirely different. You didn't have to tell anyone, he said slowly. Yes, I did. That's how the process is supposed to work. Ryan was quiet in a way I hadn't seen from him before. My father had found a chair in the corner and seemed to be sitting inside himself. My mother's voice came out sharp and controlled. This is all quite dramatic, she disclosed. Fine. Then there's no issue. Marcus looked at her. There's an issue. Marcus, Ryan said quietly. No. His voice was not raised, just clear. I've spent the past 10 minutes understanding that the person who sat at that table and got mocked in front of strangers is someone who, when she had every professional reason to stay silent and let someone else handle my file without my knowledge, instead disclosed the relationship immediately and removed herself. And you, he looked at my mother, directly talked to her like she was an inconvenience. My mother blinked, unused to it. She is Ryan's sister, Marcus continued. She's a physician on a provincial review committee, and she did the right thing before anyone asked her to. You might want to think about what that says about who she is, and what your behavior tonight says about who you are. The room held that. My father's voice came from the corner, rough and quiet. We've made mistakes. My mother turned toward him as though he'd said something in a foreign language. We made mistakes, he said again, more slowly. With her. A long time ago. We chose differently. With Ryan. With money. With how we handled things. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the carpet, at something interior and overdue. She shouldn't have had to do any of it the way she did. Ryan's face had gone still. Dad, I said carefully. He finally looked up. His eyes were wet, and I hadn't expected that. My father was not a person who showed that particular thing often. I didn't push back, he said. When I should have. I knew the form. I knew what it meant. I told myself it wasn't my place to contradict your mother, and I let you leave, and I told myself you'd be fine. He stopped. You were fine. But that's not the same as being right, my mother said very quietly. This is not the time. When is the time? My father looked at her. Not with anger, with a tiredness that had apparently been accumulating for some years. Ryan turned to me. He had the careful expression of someone who has just understood a version of their own history that they hadn't known existed. She said, you just left, he said. She said you decided medicine wasn't worth it and you wanted to work instead. I met his eyes. I left because the alternative was going into debt I couldn't manage, alone, for a decade, while watching you receive every kind of support I'd been told wasn't available. Ryan's throat worked. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, I said. You were younger. You didn't make those decisions. But you asked. I believed her, he said, very quietly. I know. Marcus sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, as people do when the room they thought they were in turns out to be a different room entirely. Then he looked at my mother. She had retreated into a kind of rigid stillness, the composure of a person refusing to process something in real time. You told your son she quit, he said. You told him she chose not to pursue it. She said nothing. And she was here tonight being introduced as the leftover seat at the table. Ryan stood up. The movement surprised everyone, I think including him. He walked to where I was sitting and stood there for a moment, and then he said, I'm sorry. I don't know what I didn't know. But I'm sorry. It was not a complete accounting. It was the beginning of one. And it was more than I'd expected from that room on that night, so I accepted it for what it was. Okay, I said. My mother said, this family does not need to air itself out in front of. He's going to be my husband, Ryan said, turning to face her, and she's my sister. You don't get to decide who gets to be in this conversation. That was the moment my mother went quiet. Not because she agreed, because she had run into something she hadn't sufficiently modeled her younger child, her supported child, declining to perform her version of events. The rest of the evening did not recover. That's not how these things work. Guests filtered out. The catered food got wrapped in containers. Marcus and Ryan sat together in the kitchen for a long time talking in low voices. My father stayed in the sunroom. My mother moved through the house doing small tasks with focused efficiency, which was her way of surviving anything she couldn't control. I found my coat. My father intercepted me near the door. He looked the way people look when they've been carrying weight for long enough that they've stopped noticing it until someone points it out. "I didn't fight for you," he said. "No. I've thought about it. Since. You don't know that, but I have. I believe you." He looked uncertain. Is that enough?" I considered him for a moment. This man who had given me the geography of my first 22 years, who had been genuinely kind to me in small ways throughout my childhood, who had looked at a form on a kitchen table and said, "Your mother's right," and closed his laptop, who had spent years constructing himself as a person who didn't take sides, and had not noticed that not taking sides is itself a side. "It's a place to start," I said. He nodded. His eyes were wet again. "You didn't have to recuse yourself. You could have stayed on the file and been completely fair. No one would have known. I would have known." He looked at me for a long moment. "You always were more than we understood." That sentence was complicated. I let it sit. I drove back to Toronto in the dark with the heat on and the radio off. The city appeared gradually, towers lit against November sky, the highway emptying as I got closer to downtown. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel released. I felt something quieter than either of those things. The specific stillness that comes after truth has been said and can't be unsaid, and there's nothing left to brace for. 3 months later, the investigation opened. Not because I initiated it. Because my recusal disclosure prompted a routine audit of the original file assignment process, which surfaced a procedural irregularity in how the referral had been logged, not connected to me, not connected to anything I'd done. Systems do their own accounting. I was interviewed once, gave a 3-paragraph statement, and was thanked for the clarity of my documentation. Marcus's file was reassigned, assessed on its full merits, and moved forward through the appropriate channels. Ryan called me in February. Just to talk, which was new. We spoke for 40 minutes about ordinary things, his work, my schedule, a series we'd both apparently been watching without knowing it. At the end, he said, "I talked to Mom. About the form." I waited. "She said she doesn't remember it the way you do." A pause. "I believe you." "Okay," I said. "I'm going to need some time to figure out what I do with that." "That's fair." Marcus and Ryan married the following June. Small ceremony, north of the city, family, and close friends. I sat at a table near the front. My mother sat across the room and we exchanged a nod that held everything neither of us was going to say. My father walked over during dinner and sat beside me for 20 minutes and talked about the garden he'd started in the backyard, and the specific challenges of growing tomatoes in Ontario. Regret woven in between the ordinary details of his life, waiting to see if I would receive it. I did, not because I had resolved everything, because I had decided that the cost of permanent hardness was higher than the cost of selective generosity. Marcus found me near the end of the evening. He looked genuinely happy, which suited him. He said, "I know I said it before, but you didn't have to handle it the way you did. The disclosure. The recusal. You could have done the minimum." "The minimum wasn't enough," I said. He smiled. "No, it wasn't." He paused. "Ryan talks about you more now." "I know. We've been talking. He didn't know who you were, what you'd built." "He does now." Marcus nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I see it. What you built, without any of them behind you." I looked across the room at my father laughing at someone's joke, at my mother adjusting the centerpiece, at Ryan watching his husband walk back toward him with the expression of a man whose life was cooperating with his expectations. "It's worth something," I said. I drove home under a wide summer sky. The city was long and bright behind me. The radio was on this time, something quiet, something that didn't demand anything. I had a morning shift in 3 days, 2 patients waiting on assessments I was part of, a system that functioned because people did their jobs with precision and honesty, and the willingness to disclose what needed disclosing even when it was inconvenient. People ask if I regret how it happened. If the dinner party, the pale face, the sunroom conversation, if any of that was what I wanted. What I wanted, at 22, was a signature on a form. That's all. A parent's co-signature on a financial document, the kind that costs nothing but the willingness to act like your child's future matters as much as your convenience. What I got instead was a decade of building something without a foundation anyone gave me, and then a room full of people learning, one by one, that what gets built on your own terms is still built. That's not a consolation. It's just what happened. I kept going. I kept the standards. I kept the work. And when the moment finally came, I didn't need to raise my voice. I only needed to be exactly who I already was.